Hey,
See you.
hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I'm admitting a whole lot of people here all at once, so
All right,
I know your faces out there already.
good. There's Mary Ellen over here.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for doing this. We're so excited.
Well, good. I'm glad. I'm happy to be doing it.
Yeah, it'll be
Yeah.
fun.
Ken Crotty just came on here.
All right.
Cool.
How are you?
And I'm gonna come in and out.
Switch the gallery view. There we go. Oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of people.
Yep. Ah, there's even a little kid here.
Yeah.
Kid?
Oh,
Might be scary for her.
Where's the nice
Who all's here now?
Why is that not?
We've got a baby.
That's one of my grandkids.
Sweet.
I know.
What you been doing today?
Who's mom? That
Look, Mary Ellen. Whoops. Oh, good. See, I'm sorry. Yeah.
that you,
Give-
Stacy?
Going to give our meeting a couple of minutes and then we're going to get started because we are time limited anyways.
She's so cute. Hello. Get her teddy bear.
We need more Emma. There she is.
Glasses. These are my computer glasses. Oh, yeah, my earphones didn't fly out.
Okay, while I continue to admit people here, let me tell you a couple of things before we get started on some ghost stories. First of all, happy Halloween to all of you.
Happy Halloween.
Either 7 months late or 5 months early, whichever way you want to look at it. It is, I kind of designed this thing as a respite from everything that's happening
Sorry.
in our world in the last few months, which is really quite amazing in a lot of ways for not only someone like me who's a historian, but for all of us in this country and in the world. But in light of everything else that's happened in our country in the last few days, it's almost awkward to do this kind of thing. But I think in some ways we still need that respite from the real world right now. And we need to just think about some other things. And so for after a course of an hour, I think that's what we'll do, is just kind of think about something other than the problems of the world and hope that things will improve as time goes on. So I'm going to ask you to mute yourselves. It makes it an awful lot easier to do.
I'll do mine.
I will leave some time at the end for you to ask questions or make comments or anything like that. That shouldn't be an issue. And I know that sometimes you want to ask a question right at the particular moment, but that makes it very difficult when you're doing a Zoom event. So if you kind of bear with me on that, I'll give you the opportunity at the end to do this. There's a lot of you here from a lot of different places, not just the Capital District or not just the, there's people from all over the place here.
Yep.
Certainly for those of you who are in this area, I will make it clear as to what place I'm talking about. For the rest of you, that really isn't going to have any bearing or importance to you at all. But the bottom line is the stories I'm going to tell you are pretty compelling in themselves anyways. So I don't think you really have to live in this area to really appreciate the stories that I'm going to share with you today. The other thing I want to point out is that there's a lot of historians who will not do this kind of thing. They will not do ghost stories because they don't believe it's real history. And there certainly is a lot of credibility to that. There are things I'm going to tell you that I can't prove to you. I like to deal in facts. I don't like to deal in conjecture or even the supernatural.
It's talking, yeah.
Ghost stories are somewhat of a folklore of a lot of towns and a lot of areas. And in that respect, I think they do have a bearing and they do have importance. So for those of you who are purists in terms of history, I apologize, but I think in the practical sense, it really does make an awful lot of sense.
Thank you. Okay, see you in a bit. Bye.
And for those people who I've just admitted and have just come on, if you would mute yourselves, please, I would appreciate it. Let me get started. I'm going to tell you a number of different stories. Hopefully, you're going to enjoy these stories. And a lot of them are based partially, in fact, but I can't prove to you the ghost part of a lot of these stories. So, for those of you who don't know me, and I think I know a number of names that are on here, but there may be some people who don't know me. My name is Rick Reynolds. I am a historian for the town of Ballston in Saratoga County, which is in upstate New York. No, we are nowhere near New York City, and we don't want to be considered near New York City. We are very different from New York City in a lot of ways. The place that I live is a pretty rural kind of place near Saratoga Springs, which some of you may be familiar with as well. So this little place that I live in, and the place that I'm a historian for, is called Burnt Hills. Now, some of you know the story of why it's called Burnt Hills, and very quickly, because it's not really a ghost story, it had to do with the people of Schenectady, which was a Dutch settlement, now known by its English name of Schenectady. The Dutch settlement of Schenectady would look up at the hills north of them, and they would see the hills were on fire. They wondered why they were on fire. Well, as time went on, they learned that what was happening is the Indians were burning the hillsides. And they burned those hillsides because they wanted the deer to be attracted to the area as the new growth came up out of the ground. And so the people of Schenectady named this place the land of the burnt hills. But there is another story, a much more ominous story about this. And it has to do with Indians, but it also has to do with some white men, and not very nice white men. During the 1600s, the white men came over to America to get furs. There was big money in furs. So if they could make some money on these furs, they were going to get as many furs as they could, send them back home and sell them. Well, the white men weren't quite as good hunters as the Indians were, because the Indians have been doing this for a long time. So the white men, while they're out hunting in this area that we now call Burnt Hills, come across a couple of Indians. These Indians already had some furs draped over their shoulders because they had already killed some animals, and they were taking them back to their settlements to use for whatever purposes they may have had at that time. Well, the white men, because this is what they did, killed the Indians, stole the furs, and then burned the area to cover up their crime. The land of the burnt hills. In the years after this happened, and we don't know exactly when it happened because it's folklore, it probably is the 1600s. It could have been late 1600s. Some of the people who started moving into this area noticed eerie kinds of feelings in this area as they walked through the land of the burnt hills. Was that the ghosts of those Indians or of those white men? Was it something else? Was it just an aura about the place? We have no way of knowing. But those Indians may have come back as ghosts to haunt this area. The land of the burnt hills. All right, let me take you a little bit further north, and later in time, to a place called Ballston Spa, which is about 10 minutes north of the burnt hills area that I just talked about. And I'm talking about a place on Route 67. Those of you who are local will know this area. On Route 67, there's a section going west out of Ballston Spa Village in which there are a whole series of Ballston Spa elementary schools all gathered together, a campus of Ballston Spa elementary schools. And kind of right smack in the middle of that campus of elementary schools is an old house. It looks like an old Victorian mansion. It is huge. And the elementary kids who go to school in those elementary schools there are always a little freaked by this house. They're scared of it. They think it's creepy and scary. Well, they don't know what happened there in most cases, but you are going to find out what happened there with a man named Crandall, Sylvester Crandall, who lived in that house in the mid to late 1800s. Lived there with his wife, and he, as would be the case with most people at that time, he was pretty much the breadwinner. He was a stockbroker. He had made a lot of money, but he'd been a bit careless with his money and lost most of his money. And so he and his wife would have rip-roaring fights over money. She was very disappointed in him. He probably was very disappointed in himself as well. But after these fights were over with, and it was very common for people to hear the fights who lived in the vicinity, although there probably weren't an awful lot of people in that vicinity, they would know there were fights going on. It was that loud and raucous. But after the fights, Mr. Crandall would retreat all the way to the top story of his house. There was a little cupola way up in the top of his house. And a little cupola is kind of like a little tower at the very top of a house. And that would be his respite from this fight and his way to get away from the bad situation that existed. Well, as time went on, these fights got worse and worse and worse. Things between the two of them did not get any better in any way. Fortunately, as far as we know, there were no kids in the house, so they were not subjected to the difficulties that were going on there. Well, finally, the wife's mother, sister-in-law, I believe it was, and her daughter by another marriage came to the house to take the wife away, to get her out of this awful situation. They were seated at a kitchen table, probably having something to eat or drink or something of that sort, when all of a sudden, Sylvester Crandall arrives in the room with a gun in his hand. Kills his wife's mother. He kills the sister-in-law. The wife goes and hides in another room. But when she comes out, she is shot and she runs outside. Mr. Crandall then takes himself up to the cupola in his house and kills himself. In the end, his wife also dies. So it's 4 deaths. So why is that a ghost story? For two reasons. In the months after this, when the house is vacant, there are numerous reports of a man very definitely resembling Sylvester Crandall roaming around the house and going into the house. Also, the cupola is lit up at night. There's a light on, probably a lantern of some kind. Goes off by dawn. Why does that light go on and off the way it does? No one seems to be able to know what's going on, and everyone knows that the family is now deceased. So how is this happening? But the story gets stranger. A few years later, a person who lives down the street a ways, actually the man lives on Mann Road, M-A-N-N Road, which if you're familiar with that area, Mann Road is almost right across from this creepy house. Mann Road was the home of the Mann family, and they'd lived there since the 1700s. In fact, the house still stands to this day. It's not inhabited by anybody in the Mann family. But in 1887, someone in the Mann family got his wagon stuck in the process of going to or from his house. And an unknown man comes along to help him out. Mr. Mann insisted from that time on that the man who helped him was Sylvester Crandall. Now, how could it be Sylvester Crandall who was dead? Was it a ghost? Was it somebody else? Is this all mistaken identities, or is there something real to this supernatural story of the Crandall Mansion? Those of you who live here, next time you go by this big old Victorian house in the midst of all those elementary schools in Ballston Spa, take a look at that house and remember the story of the Crandall family, how they died at the hands of Mr. Crandall. All right, before I continue with the next story, I just ask, let me admit a couple other people here who are waiting. I'd ask you if there is someone in the room besides the one person who is logged on. If you just kind of put a finger up in front of the screen so I can get an idea of how many others are here who are not on the screen itself, just so I can get a count of people here. Okay. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, thank you. So we have about 1, 5, 25. We got 35 or 40 people here. 36 people, 36 logged on. So it's really more like 46 people that we got here. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Okay, let me keep going here. Let's come back to the Ballston Lake area and do a couple of stories from Ballston Lake. And one of them has to do with a tavern, a place called Carney's, which has been a establishment in this town since the 1830s. It was a tavern. It was a barber shop at one point. In the back of it was a place where they fixed horse shoes. The horses, of course, were very popular when you go back into the 1800s and early 1900s. So you got a place that's been around for a long time. But from probably the 1880s or so, it was a restaurant, a bar, an inn, not a place of great reputation in many cases, kind of a dive bar in many cases. During the 1930s, it was owned by a couple named McDonough. It was called McDonough's at that point. And Mrs. McDonough tried to clean it up a little bit. And on the bar, she kept what's called a swear jar. And anytime you swore, you had to put a quarter in that jar. She made a lot of money. Well, she sold it, or she and her husband sold it, and they sold it to a guy named Bruce Allen. Bruce Allen really wanted to do some good stuff with this place. He was really gung-ho. He was a relatively young guy. He was in his 30s, and he really wanted to improve the place and make it into a very nice place for people to come and have a beer, have a drink, or to have some food. Well, Bruce Allen, shortly after he purchased the place, at the age of 36, died suddenly. Very, very unfortunate situation. He had named the place Bruce's Empty Arms Hotel. It actually had some rooms upstairs, tiny rooms, which is what they used to have 150 years ago, just tiny little rooms where you would stay. You didn't need anything like a big hotel room like we have in many cases today. Well, Bruce Allen's passing allowed the place to be passed into the hands of other people until finally by 1982, it was purchased by a family named Carney. And the Carney family also made some significant improvements to the place. And they liked to close up the place at night after everybody had gone. And one of the owners, Bob Carney, who is no longer with us, would very often sit at the bar at the end of the evening, have himself a drink before he made his way home. He lived right up the street, so it was a walk home. And it was usually pretty late at night. One night, he's seated at the bar. He's having himself a drink. And all of a sudden, the only light that's on in the place is the jukebox. Now, those of you who are familiar with what jukeboxes look like, they do tend to produce a lot of light. So it really lit up the place pretty good. But for some reason, that jukebox attracted his eye on that particular night. And he looked over at it, and there's a shadowy white figure standing at the jukebox. But the minute Bob looks at that shadowy figure, it disappears. Now, Bob had been acquainted with Bruce Allen. He knew him. In fact, had talked to him and known him quite well. He swore after that evening that Bruce Allen was in the bar checking the place out. So, a year later, the bartender, a lady named Kathy, who's been a bartender there for 35 years and continues to be, and hopefully will be when the restaurant reopens after the pandemic, she's in the place all by herself. She's closing up that night. Bob had already gone home. She hears footsteps on the stairs. She didn't necessarily think much of it at the time, but as she hears it over and over again on other nights, she begins to wonder, is there somebody actually walking around? Well, maybe there is. The stairs are very creaky. It's an 1830s building, and you can hear when people go up and down. Is Carney's Tavern haunted? Is Bruce Allen still there checking out that place and seeing what's going on there and hopefully approving of what's going on there? He loved that place. Maybe he just doesn't want to leave. So the next time you're in this area, check out Carney's Tavern. I guess I'm giving a free advertisement by telling that story. Hopefully they don't mind that. I doubt if they would very much. So let's stay right in Ballston Lake. Stay right in Ballston Lake. Go to the northern part of the lake itself. The lake, which used to be called Long Lake, now is called Ballston Lake. Another ghost story from the Ballston Lake area. And this one concerns the Jones family. The Jones family lived north of the lake for local residents, probably in the area of Outlook Road. And they lived in a house that they probably built for themselves in the late 1700s. They lived there pretty much secluded from the rest of the world. They were not social. They were not social at all. Hang on, I gotta let a couple people in here again. Okay, I think everybody's let in again. Okay, so they're secluded in this area. They are not social people in any way, but there were other people who lived in the general vicinity.
Is that okay if I have this?
Mrs. Warren, can you mute yourself?
Sorry.
So the Jones family lives there. Well, at one point, Mr. Jones leaves. No one knows why he leaves or what's going on because he has contact with him. But some years later, he comes back. But in between there is the Revolutionary War. And as it turns out, Mr. Jones went off to fight on the rebel side against the British in the Revolutionary War. However, when he got into the war, or maybe even before he got into the war, he decided to become a traitor. And he started giving secrets from the rebels to General John Burgoyne, who was one of the British generals, and one of the generals who was at the Battle of Saratoga. So when he came back from the war, there was a price on his head. He was wanted. Of course, this is before the days of wanted posters and things like that. But he was wanted, and there was a significant reward for his capture. A man who lived in that area where he lived decided to try to get Mr. Jones. So he kind of staked out the house and would watch oftentimes to see if Mr. Jones ever came back to the house, which had been vacated by that. One day, he sees Mr. Jones walking all around the house, peering in all the windows, and finally entering the house itself. Well, he immediately goes to the house. He, on his own, grabs the guy, takes him to the authorities, and turns him in. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Jones is hanged for his crime because it is the most heinous of all crimes. Man, whose name we do not know, who is staking out the house, continues to kind of watch over the house, which is deteriorating more and more as time goes on. Suddenly, he sees a man walking around the house, peering in the windows, looking at everything around there, going inside the house. He doesn't go to investigate the situation, but he swore the man looked just like Mr. Jones. Was that the ghost of Mr. Jones coming back to the house? Was it a result of the liquor that the man had purchased with much of the reward money that he had gained? And that is a question we will never know for sure. All right, let's go outside this area a little bit to a place that some of you may be familiar with, called the Top Notch Tavern. Top Notch Tavern, which is in Hegeman, New York, which is away in Amsterdam, famous for its prime rib, and famous back maybe 40 years ago for giving us giving us free shrimp with our prime rib. Really nice deal at that time. Well, this Top Notch Tavern was a tavern for many, probably 100 or more years. It was owned by a number of different people, but at one point it was owned by a couple who had a little girl. She was a young girl, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Unfortunately, when the girl was about 7 or 8 years old, but the little girl had always played with this favorite little dolly. She loved this little dolly, and when the little girl passed away, they took the dolly and they put it on a shelf in the restaurant so that they would always remember their daughter and this little dolly that was her favorite toy. Well, in the months after that, there were lots of stories told by the owners of this restaurant, the parents who were devastated by their daughter's death, that when they would come into work once in a while, the dolly would be in a little different location. Sometimes it would be on the bar. Sometimes it would be on a table. Sometimes it would be on the floor. And they surmised that the dolly had been played with by the little girl who came back to play with her dolly. The Top Notch Tavern is now closed, but just before it closed, and in quite a few years before it closed, the dolly was in the entryway to the restaurant, as was the gravestone of the little girl. And I do not know why that gravestone was not in the cemetery where she was buried and why it was in the restaurant, but it sat there for many years. The Top Notch Tavern, the little girl with her dolly. All right, let me tell you one more, and then I'm going to open up for some questions. One of my favorites, which is pretty much a true story from what we can tell. Prove it to you, of course. And it has relevance in today's world, for sure. Story of a man named Angus McDiarmid. Angus lived on a road called Hop City Road. Angus McDiarmid was a crusty old guy. He had been kicked out of Scotland. It takes a lot to get kicked out of a country. He had insulted a count. He had insulted royalty. Back in the late 1700s, you do not insult royalty and get away with it. So they kicked him out. He came over here, he built a house on what is today Hop City Road, where there were lots of hops grown. That's why they called it that. And he had some interesting experiences. One time he was visited by the British Army, who were coming in to find a rebel general who lived here. And they all walked into his house because they wanted to see what his wife was doing. And his wife was working on a spinning wheel. They had never seen anybody use a spinning wheel before. They used to see it. Well, with all these men standing on the floor of his house, the floor gave out and everybody ended up in what we would call a basement. It was probably just a crawl space. We have no evidence that anybody got injured. At least nobody wrote about that. But Mr. McDiarmid, Angus McDiarmid, had to fix up his house after the British Army left there. But the more important story, there was a bad thunderstorm. And Angus McDiarmid, who was a farmer, was very aware that during thunderstorms, his cows might not be where they're supposed to. And I'm always impressed with farmers because they have such incredible senses. And he's not in the place where they should be. So he takes off outside to get his cows back to where they belong during this horrible thunderstorm. And as he walks out the back door, he smells a terrible smell. Rotten eggs. And for some reason, he looks up at the sky and he sees this big white blob in the sky. This blob has a head, and the head has a slouch hat on it. And the feet on this blob in the sky are cloven. In other words, they have 2 digits rather than 5 digits like we have on feet and hands. He realizes full well that what he's seeing is the devil. He's scared out of his wits. He runs off back into the house, tells his wife, I will be good for the rest of my life. I will go to church religiously for the rest of my life. And he does. Part of the story that's relevant for today, the street that is right next to his house today is called Devil's Lane. Okay, some questions. We have maybe 5 minutes. Questions. Anybody have any questions or comments or reactions? Wow, you guys are easy. Yeah, make sure you unmute yourselves if you're going to say something. Go ahead. I think it's Kim, yeah?
Yeah, I wondered if the house for Jones is still there. You said it's
No.
decaying, or no, the house is gone?
Totally gone. We don't even know exactly where it was, so I wouldn't know where to look for it anyways. So, no, it isn't there. But it's in the outlet road area someplace.
Okay,
That's all I can tell you.
okay, thanks.
And
Rick?
Does anyone know, who lives in the Crandall house now?
I don't know who lives there now.
But it
Someone
is
does.
occupied.
It
Okay.
is occupied, yes. I should talk to them. They're actually in the town of Milton, so I have less contact with them. But I really should talk to them and time I use their house in this.
Yeah, really.
They really should know that. Randy, go for it.
Rick?
Randy.
Are there any scary stories that have resulted from Hawkwood?
The only scary stories I hear about Hawkwood are the scary stories that people from the 1960s tell me about all the parties they have, and the beer parties, and the drinking, and taking the glassware and everything that was in the house and playing target practice with it. Scary stories. They're not ghost stories, but they're
No.
mighty scary to me.
Yep. Okay.
Another question, Susan?
Yes,
Susan?
wasn't there also stories?
I can't hear you. Can't hear you.
About,
You're-
tavern of the,
You're breaking up completely.
can you hear me now?
I can hear you better now, yes.
Okay, go ahead. Go
Go ahead,
on.
okay. Okay, somebody else had a question. I think.
Okay. Top Notch Tavern, weren't there also some of the,
Weren't there also what?
oh, sorry, the stories
No,
of
you're breaking up. You're breaking up again.
chandeliers swaying.
Yes.
Top Notch.
There are. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot of stories from a lot.
Go ahead.
There's some from what used to be Crystal's Restaurant in Glenville, which used to be the Pig and Whistle most recently. That was a speakeasy at one point. There are ghost stories about that, partly because they had chickens in the cellar. And they killed the chickens and then brought them upstairs and served them. That's a long time ago. That's not recently. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Karen?
Are there any current ghost stories that people are believing they're seeing something now?
I haven't heard anything recently. They're not always things people will talk about either, because they feel like they're kind of weird talking about these things.
Mm-hmm.
There have been, in a couple of cases, those TV shows that actually go out and search for ghosts, but they haven't been in this area since the 1980s, as far as I know. So there's nothing that's really viable that people are really, really interested in around here at this point in time.
Was anything ever with the DeBees house? Were there any
I've
stories?
never heard any ghost stories with the DeBees house. It's just a beautiful old house, but I've never heard any stories of it. No.
Thank you.
Oh, Rick.
Yep, Maggie?
Me? Okay. Hi, I'm Maggie Egan Cummings, and my family used to own Carney's.
Yes, I know they did.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, was it your brother who was born there?
No. My father was the last of seven who,
Right.
all right, Bill Egan was the
Right.
youngest of seven of those